Hello, fellow awakening mammals. Today we will ask the spicy question: how much of our music industry is actually controlled? And is it possible that pop culture is being instrumentalized? If you have been following mainstream music for a while, it's evident that it is becoming increasingly sexualized, violent, and superficial. But is this by design? Or is this just the organic evolution of artistic expression? To answer this question, we need to understand where and how pop culture emerged. Let's go back to the 1950s, when names like Ray Charles, Chuck Berry, and Elvis Presley shaped the decade. In my opinion, this marked the beginning of a counterculture movement challenging old established social norms. You have to understand, before the 50s and 60s, Western culture was largely characterized by conservative social norms, strict gender roles, and a strong emphasis on traditional family values. You would have never seen a boy with long hair or a woman concentrating on her career. The peak of said counterculture was in the mid-60s, when hippies emerged. During the same time, bands became so huge, it became a global phenomena. Bands like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the Beach Boys reshaped our understanding of success. Particularly the Beatles had such an extreme impact on music and culture in general. We will dedicate a whole episode just on the Beatles in the coming weeks. But back to the hippies. What many people fail to realize is that before the 1950s and 1960s, there wasn't as much emphasis on catering to the preferences of young people. Today, most mainstream music is trying to connect with teenagers, but that wasn't always the case. Before that, musicians typically catered to a more mature audience. Interesting side note, the wide use of the term teenager started also in the 50s and 60s. A whole new demographic subgroup was established, and for the first time in Western culture, people actually cared what adolescents had to say, to the point that the USA had to pull out of Vietnam because of all the tension on campuses throughout the nation. Okay, that's all interesting and stuff, but where am I going with this? Well, at the end of the video, you will know why this point is so important. Promise. So how and why would this be a psyop? Wouldn't it be a good thing that young people feel more valued and catered to? If we dig just a little deeper, we see a lot of connections between certain think tanks and the counterculture of the 60s. Think tanks like the Tavistock Institute or the Frankfurt Institute of Sociology were indicative of the culture change of that time period. But today, I would like to concentrate on a different part of the world, a region we've already focused on in various other videos. The City of Angels, or to be more specific, a certain street named Laurel Canyon in the Hollywood Hills. Today, LA is known for its vibrant music industry. LA is recognized as one of, if not the most important cities for the industry. But that wasn't always the case. Its significance began in the mid-1960s, when many bands suddenly moved to Laurel Canyon. While many believe San Francisco was the epicenter of the hippie movement, which isn't entirely false, Laurel Canyon was just as, if not more, important for the movement. Bands like the Byrds, the Mamas and Papas, the Doors, the Eagles, and Frank Zappa, to name a few, all moved to Laurel Canyon. The peculiar thing is that at the time when they first moved there, Los Angeles wasn't the musical hub it is today. Sure, Los Angeles was already vast and boasted a vibrant film industry, but it was notably lacking in infrastructure for musicians. So why did so many bands, which were fairly new and not famous yet, decided to move there? And while they were still fairly unknown, a bunch of different venues decided to open up at the same time. Coincidentally, now famous venues like Whiskey Go-Go and The Trip opened at that time. Those venues often hosted those aspiring bands, and they became, almost overnight, super famous. Now, why were a bunch of new nightclubs opened for bands that haven't really existed yet? It didn't help that most of those bands I just mentioned weren't really good at the beginning. For example, parts of the Byrds' first album weren't even recorded by them. Instead, they were recorded by more seasoned musicians they hired. In my opinion, their success doesn't seem organic. Sure, this could be all a coincidence. Even more intriguing is the fact that an overwhelming majority of those bands had parents connected to the highest echelons of politics and the military. For instance, do you recognize this kid? No? This is Jim Morrison, front singer of The Doors. These pictures were taken only a few years apart. For the younger generation, The Doors were a really influential band in the 60s, with songs like Riders on the Storm,
Riders on the storm. Riders on the storm.
Light my fire.
Come on, light my fire.
People are strange.
People are strange when you're a stranger. Faces look ugly when you're alone.
Guess who the older gentleman is in that picture? Correct. It is his father, an admiral of the US Navy. Interestingly, he was the commanding officer of the USS Bonhomme Richard, a US Navy aircraft carrier, when the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred, which ultimately led the US into the Vietnam War, which we know later was a false flag operation. The US faked an attack so they could start yet another war. Or let's look at this gentleman, Frank Zappa, also very influential. His dad was a chemist working at the Edgewood Arsenal, where some of the MK-Ultra projects were conducted. Coincidentally, that's also where a lot of research with LSD was conducted. Now, it doesn't take much to connect the LSD to the hippies. Another interesting side note is that Frank Zappa's wife attended the same kindergarten as Jim Morrison. Small world, huh? I'm sure this is just another coincidence. Unfortunately for us, coincidences won't pay our rent. So if you enjoyed this video so far, please consider liking the video. There are countless examples of famous musicians from Laurel Canyon with ties to the military. So many it is hard to believe it's pure coincidence. Consequently, there used to be an Air Force base located right there, named Lookout Mountain. You think Hollywood had cutting-edge filmmaking technology? Well, Lookout Mountain had so much high-tech, it made Hollywood look like Bollywood. It is safe to assume they developed a lot of tech there, which Hollywood used, once declassified. Furthermore, it has been said that a lot of Hollywood stars at that time frequented the base. Apparently, Jack Nicholson was seen there often. Lookout Mountain isn't in operation anymore, but the building is still there, and guess who owns it now? Jared Leto, the frontman of 30 Seconds to Mars. To summarize our small history lesson, it seems odd to me that many children of high-ranking officers would all decide within a few years to move to a small area near a military base where there previously wasn't any infrastructure for their musical careers. Without the musicians of Laurel Canyon, today's world would have been completely different. The hippies and other counterculture groups wouldn't have been possible. In my opinion, there is a good chance that a lot of those musicians from that time were casted or perhaps installed there to push a new world view. Is it just another coincidence that at the same time, musicians started to target teenagers with their music? Is it maybe because it is easier to manipulate kids than older adults? If that is true, what implications does it have for our modern artists? Are some artists placed to change the zeitgeist once again? Is maybe the increase of violence, drugs and perversion planned? If yes, what is the end goal? What do you think? Do you think this is just one big coincidence? Or do you think most mainstream artists are instrumentalized? Again, if you enjoyed the video, please like the video, and if you don't want to miss any episode, please consider subscribing. We at Awakening Apes will publish a new video every Thursday from now on. Thank you for watching, and see you next video.